I was doing final presentations in my first year biology class yesterday, and my computer ran out of memory to store the Zoom videos. And we like to have our students go back and look at their presentations so that they can kind of do a self-evaluation. And I lost 3 of the 4 presentations because of just the fact that William Joel College gave me a computer that has a hard drive the size of a thumb drive. I actually have 2 thumb drives bigger than the hard drive that I currently have on this computer. So, and it just told me again that I have insufficient memory to record my Zoom call. This Zoom call, but I know for a fact that I have like 12 gigs on my hard drive, so I don't understand why it's not behaving. How are the rest of you guys doing? Kenton, how are you?
I'm Tartarus. I'm Kronos and Tartarus. I'm Death Decay. That's some poetry I read the other day.
Okay, I am not familiar with that poetry. What poetry is that?
It's something I wrote, but then I read it and I thought it was good.
Ah, gotcha. So I can't go and look it up.
No, but maybe it'll be published sometime. I don't know. That's probably
okay.
Probably a stretch.
Do you do poetry on a regular basis?
Yeah, I do.
You know that there's a literary magazine at Jewel where you could submit your work.
Inscaped.
Yeah. Have you ever written anything for that?
Yeah, I did some art for it last year, but I think I'm gonna publish some or try to submit some other things this year.
Okay. Blake, how are you doing?
I'm good. I have a final today, so just preparing for that.
A final today? That's against college policy.
Well, it's not really like a final. It's just sort of our last assignment. We don't have a final.
Ah, gotcha. What class is that in?
It's a systems thinking class in entrepreneurship.
Winston, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Trying to get to the finish line of the semester.
Okay. Well, today what we're going to do in this class is we're going to talk about food deserts, finish up that conversation. And then on Friday, we will just spend time answering questions that you might have about the final. So between now and Friday, look over materials as you prepare for the final. And then we'll just spend Friday kind of in sort of test review mode. And then that'll be it for us. So today's the last day of heavy lifting. So put on your critical thinking caps and here we go. First off, I want to get your thoughts on what we went over Monday. So we talked about food deserts, this idea that there is a uneven distribution of food outlets in the Kansas City area. And we talked about that uneven distribution in the context of redlining. So kind of my first question to you is, as you think about redlining, what do you think the potential economic impacts are of redlining? And just to begin with, let's remind ourselves of what redlining was. It was this system of categorizing tracts of land as desirable or less desirable based on the people who live there, the status, the current status in 1933-34 of the available housing, the condition of the housing, the constitution of the communities in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, et cetera. And if you were judged to be in the grade C or grade D areas of town, it was more difficult to get loans for houses. It was more difficult to get loans for starting out small businesses, et cetera. So the first thing I want you guys to talk about is kind of what you think the economic impacts of this kind categorization scheme might have been to the communities that lived in these areas. Speak at will.
I'd say that the way redlining practice has been most damning for certain communities is the way that redlining overall participates in a schema of racial capitalism in order to differentiate geographically where both resources and access to resources are concentrated. And that geography ends up being drawn along racial lines.
Yeah, and it was explicitly racial. And if you go and read all of the descriptions, race was definitely a part of it. What do you mean by racial capitalism? I'm not familiar with that term.
The term racial capitalism is something being popularized. I see critical race theorists use it the most. The idea of it is to draw historical accent on the way that capitalism was birthed alongside slavery practices, which critical race theory will say is race itself, insofar as historically our ideas of blackness and whiteness as melanated categories, as categories that concentrate themselves on the epidermal layer, on the layer of skin, are these ideas of race as something concentrated on the skin is something that actually only emerges alongside the transatlantic slave trade, which historically is also the emergence of capitalism and how capitalism builds its literal infrastructure in America.
Okay, so everybody else thinking about that, when we think about these sections of Kansas City, how many of you just raise your hand digitally on the response or reaction tab? How many of you are from the Kansas City area? Just raise your hand if you are. Blake, Olivia. Oh, Blake, Olivia, and me are the only ones. Okay. So especially for Blake and Olivia, what do you know about those sections of town that were redlined when you look at those maps?
The plaza area.
What's that, Olivia?
The plaza. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you very well.
The plaza.
Oh, actually, it's north of the plaza, south of the river, and east of the plaza also. So let's see. Let me go get the maps so we can take a look at them. I should have prepared one that just had a map of the city with it, the area redlined. So the plaza actually is kind of right here in this green-blue area. So everything that we're talking about that was red and yellow lined is pretty much between the area just north of the plaza, north to the river, and then east into North Kansas City, west into North Kansas City, and east out towards modern day Independence. And so the area around the plaza was actually the green and blue demarcated area right here. And so that was actually one of these areas that was developed by J.C. Nichols, who was one of the early proponents of redlining in Kansas City, as well as a proponent of having this done throughout the United States. He was actually one of the movers and shakers in the redlining movement, strangely enough, which is why there's a move now to have his name removed from landmarks around the city because of this racially charged history that he has of having been instrumental in setting development patterns that extended into, decades into the future, almost 100 years now into the future. So, so what do you know about these sections of town in terms of their racial and ethnic diversity?
I know some areas down there aren't that nice, but around it's weird because there's some places that are sort of nice looking, and then there's also places that are totally not in a good shape.
Yeah, you get little pockets here and there, but those sections, especially up here in the north section, and also in the section to the east, for example, east of Troost. Troost has been a traditional dividing line between the white section of Kansas City and the African American section of Kansas City. What you see in many of these areas is still to this day they are largely made up of African American communities. Getting back to my original question, when you have a policy which basically denies loans for houses and small businesses to a group of people based on geographically where they live, and you prevent them from getting loans for housing and small businesses in other sections of the city, what does that do financially to the people who live in these red and yellow lined areas? What's the long-term economic impact of this?
It creates like a cross-generational gridlock where families are literally unable to move from the geography they have occupied in the past.
Okay, so you talk about cross-generational. What's the basis of this cross-generational perpetuation of poverty? What's the single easiest way for an American, really for the last 100 years, to increase wealth within their family that passes from one generation to another?
Education?
Not education. Thank you for playing, though.
Isn't it owning a house and having like?
Go ahead, Mary.
Isn't it owning a house and having like it appreciate over time?
Oh, it's totally owning a house. So when you own a house, that house generally gains equity. I live in probably one of the 3 or 4 smallest houses in the historic district down here in Liberty. And I bought my house in 2004. I paid $102,000 for it. Right now, its estimated value is about $136,000. So just by sitting on my ass for the last 16 years, my house has accumulated value. When I go to sell that house, that money is mine to keep, actually, and it's tax-free if it's below, I think, $250,000. So I could actually sell my house, and when I retire, move into an old folks home and just pocket that money that comes from my house. Or if I had that house, I could sign over the deed of the house to my children, if I had children, which I don't. But then they would have the house to either live in or to sell, and once again, they would be able to take all of the equity out of the house at that point. And so if you talk to economists will tell you that the single most important way in which people acquire wealth, unless you're the extremely wealthy, is by investing in owning a house. And it's such an important investment that when I was in graduate school, even on graduate student stipends, there were some people who could afford to buy a house. And it was actually, the mortgage payment was cheaper than renting an apartment in the Arlington area, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so they actually invested in a house, and then in many cases, they kept that house and then rented it after they got jobs and moved away from graduate school and things like this. So owning a house is a hugely important thing from establishing wealth and for being able to take that wealth and pass it on from one generation to the next. And so when we think about something like redlining, we're not only affecting the people at the time, but we're also affecting their children and their grandchildren, because we're denying them the ability to get a mortgage, to buy a house, or if they get a mortgage, the interest rates on the mortgage are going to be higher than if they're getting a mortgage in a more desirable section of the city. And they're going to be buying housing that is substandard, because they're going to be buying housing that they can only afford on the mortgage that they can get at the high interest rates that they can afford to pay. And so in that way, this is where the cross-generational aspect of wealth figures in. So that's one thing that happens. Kenton mentioned education. What are the consequences of this for educational opportunities? Because having a good education does also contribute to your wealth over time. I assume that you guys are here in school because you hope to get a good paying job that you wouldn't qualify for if you didn't have a college degree. What's the link between this type of lending behavior and long-term impacts on educational systems?
Public education is funded by taxpayers, meaning that when there's a public education serving a geography that has, in general, low incomes, it's going to be more poorly funded than, for example, Blue Valley Southwest, where like the general income bracket around it is much higher.
Yeah, and you're actually conflating two types of taxes, though. You're conflating income taxes with property taxes. Most public education funds come from property taxes, not income taxes. And so in Liberty, where property values are very high, property taxes are relatively high. And as a result, we have really good educational systems in the Liberty School District. If you live in an area where property values are depressed, then you have fewer receipts from property taxes. You have less funding going into education. So it isn't just income. Income affects the property that you can afford, but actually most public education is funded through property taxes. And if you have a long history of depressed real estate values because of things like the inability to get loans, et cetera, these areas will continue to have low property value bases, and as a result, they have less funding for public education. So yeah, Kenton is right. He was just sketchy on a couple of the details, because it really is about property taxes, which is then why something like redlining becomes very problematic, because that act of redlining back in the 1930s has actually, once again, reached across generations into kind of influencing property values today. As a result, you can look at school districts around the Kansas City area, and you can see that there are drastic differences in funding of school districts in these various sections of town. Think about the economics of small businesses. What impact might this have had on that front? Are you guys still there? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Think about the impact of all of this on small business development. Are some of you guys business majors? Blake, you're an entrepreneur guy.
Well, I mean, it definitely makes it very hard to start a business whenever you can't get a loan for it. So
Okay, so it's hard to start a business if you can't get a loan for it. So if you were interested, for example, in opening a small grocery, it would be harder to do it because you were unable to get a loan. Or if you were able to get a loan, that loan would come with all sorts of strings attached to it in terms of the once again, the percentage interest rate on the loan and things like that. What about the base of people who might come to your store? Let's say that you did decide to open a small neighborhood grocery store. What does the economic plight of the people around you who live in the neighborhood where you're going to put that store, what effect does that have on your ability to open the store, make a success of the store, get a loan for the store, et cetera?
I mean, you need to put it in an area that the people were wealthy enough to actually shop at your store in the first place. So you probably wouldn't choose a poor area.
Yeah, so you would want to have a store in an area where you're actually going to make money. The whole point of building a business is that it should generate income. And so once again, if you have a section of town where people are not particularly wealthy, where a lot of people don't own their homes, when people don't own homes, the neighborhood is just more transient than it would be if people didn't own homes. It just becomes kind of a sketchier business proposition. As such, it's less likely that people are going to engage in those activities, and they're not going to engage in those activities if there are also then institutional structures that discourage that type of activity. Things like redlining, making it more difficult to get a loan. I'm going to go back to the food desert thing that I had up earlier. I want to look at full service stores. Let's share screen. So can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So here we are zoomed in on the area that was redlined. This was the extent of the city back in 1934. And we can see this is the distribution of full service supermarkets. Up here at the very top edge of the map is Liberty, and you can see all those full service shopping stores here in the Liberty area. Within 5 miles of my house, I can shop at 2 different Price Choppers, a Hy-Vee, an Aldi, a Walmart that has a food section, a Target that has a food section. What other supermarkets am I missing? 6 supermarkets within 5 miles, at least 6 supermarkets within 5 miles. Those are the ones that I can think of, just sitting here in my guest room. That's all right there. And then you come down here and you look at this big area right here. So part of this is downtown Kansas City, but even downtown Kansas City, and for whatever reason, I don't see the dot for that in this data set. Even in downtown Kansas City, there's a Price Chopper. But look at this big area that doesn't have a single supermarket in it. There are supermarkets scattered around the edge, but still there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 supermarkets. And then extending all the way over into this area, there's 1 supermarket here. That's not a lot of opportunities to go to the grocery store. When you think about food and food security, what are the impacts of not having a readily available supply of the kind of food that you would buy at a full service supermarket in terms of your economics, your education, et cetera. What do we know about nutrition and how it's correlated with these things? Yeah, if you look at all this area, it's just not served, in this area over here also that is not served very well. What happens when you don't have good access to a supermarket in terms of what you eat on a day-to-day basis?
Go more towards junk food.
Okay, so you end up shopping at convenience stores. When we look at the distribution of convenience stores, what do you see in those areas where you don't have supermarkets?
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, you see there's plenty of convenience stores, but when you go into a convenience store, you're not going to be getting things like fresh fruits and vegetables. You're going to be basically getting a bunch of packaged food that, quite frankly, isn't very good for you. What does this mean in terms of your ability to, for example, if you're a child, go to school and perform well in school if you're not getting a very good diet?
It's going to be harder to focus, harder to retain information. You might get sick more often, etc. Just things that like impair your general ability to participate.
Yeah, when I go on a bike ride, if I haven't had a good meal and a good night's sleep the night before, my performance is generally pretty poor on the bike. What day was that I got dizzy while biking, Elizabeth? Yeah, Saturday I woke up, and because it was cold, I didn't ride with the normal group that I ride with on Saturday. I came to this room right here and hopped on that bicycle right there and biked indoors. And because it's all on the second floor of my house, I didn't go downstairs and eat breakfast before I hopped on the bike, and I regretted it by the time it was all said and done, because I was dizzy. I was feeling a little weak in the legs because I hadn't properly fueled. Normally, when I get up on a Saturday, I eat breakfast before I go on the bike ride, and then I eat breakfast again while I'm on the bike ride, and then I bike home from wherever we ate breakfast. And so nutrition is really important in terms of performing well. You guys in college, we tell you this as faculty because we know that it's true, but seldom do you guys listen to us. The best thing you can do to perform well in school is eat right and get enough rest. Get a good night's sleep before a test rather than staying up and cramming all night. That does you generally much more good than cramming does. So educational outcomes can be impacted indirectly by not having good access to a healthy diet. And people in these sections of the city don't have as much access to a healthy diet as I do sitting up here in Liberty. If you were a CEO of a supermarket chain, where would it make sense to you to put a supermarket? Just on the basis of supply and demand.
It would make sense to put it where there's nothing else.
It would make sense to put a supermarket where there are no other supermarkets. A number of years ago, they opened the new Hy-Vee. And just to tell you, I don't golf, but if you gave me a driver and a golf ball, I could hit a golf ball from where the old Hy-Vee was to where the new Hy-Vee is located. They're literally just right across the street from one another. And so that struck me as very odd. I realized that the building was getting old and things like this, and they wanted a bigger and a better Hy-Vee, et cetera, but it just seemed odd to me that they were going to build a new Hy-Vee right across Kansas Street from where the old Hy-Vee was. And so you have Hy-Vee investing in a new supermarket in Liberty, whereas it seems to me like I would want to put a new supermarket somewhere right around here, because that's a population of people who desperately need a supermarket. And if you put a supermarket there, you probably get quite a lot of business. So one of my questions to you is, why do we not see supermarket executives investing in supermarkets in these urban centers where there aren't a lot of supermarkets? It's like pulling teeth with you guys today. What's up? What prevents a supermarket executive from putting a supermarket in these areas?
I mean, people tend to follow the money. So like if it's a wealthier area, they're more likely to put another supermarket there. But since that's a poor area in general, they probably see it as more like a higher risk to put a supermarket there.
Okay, so you conflated two things there. You conflated wealth versus poverty with low risk versus high risk. I tend to think of other kinds of risk when I use the term risk. Why might you see beyond just the financial base of the people who live in this area? Why do you think a supermarket executive might consider this to be higher risk?
Maybe a safety factor.
Okay, so maybe a supermarket is viewed as being more likely to be broken in and robbed from, or maybe more shoplifting, et cetera, et cetera. So there's financial risk putting a supermarket in a place where people don't have as much money to spend. That's one type of risk, but then there's also this other sort of perceived risk. Where do we get those perceptions of perceived risk? Now putting myself in the mind of a CEO of a supermarket chain.
I would say general social expectations about race and poverty.
Okay, where else could we get it from, Kenton, that we've already been talking about? So that's certainly true, but where else? I'm going to make a proposition to you. So we do have these, well, what the heck just happened? We do have these perceptions of race and wealth and things like this that influence our measures of risk. But we also have people in 1934 basically saying, this section of town is risky. As a result, don't invest there because that's a risky place to invest. Then the people in the 1930s don't invest there because it's risky. So when people go to think about where to invest in Kansas City in 1950, they look at these areas and they're like, man, those areas are pretty rough. I'm not going to invest there. They're perceived as risky. Why were they perceived as risky in 1950? Well, because they were perceived as risky in 1934. 1970s come along, more people are going to invest, looking for places to invest. They don't look to these places because they're still just as risky as they were in 1950, because they were risky, viewed as risky by people in 1934. 2020 comes along. Where are you going to put your money? You're not going to put your money in these places. Why? Because they're viewed as risky. Why? Because some dude sat down with a book in 1934 and said, this is a bad place to invest. Don't go there. And it sets up this self-perpetuating perception of risk that goes from generation to generation to generation because of all of the things that we've talked about. If I had money, which I don't have much money, but I live comfortably, but I don't live comfortably enough to start a supermarket, I would put a supermarket smack dab in the middle of this section of town. For two reasons. One, I think it would be a great business investment because I think people would come to it. I don't really see it as much of a financial risk because, quite frankly, you would be providing a service that people need. And secondly, I think it would just be a great thing to do in those neighborhoods to give them a place to go and get healthy food rather than crap food at a convenience store. Yet, what you don't see in any of this area is you don't see the development of full service grocery stores. You don't see them being developed over here. Certain nonprofits view a food desert as a section of a city where you're more than 1 mile walk from a full service food outlet. And that certainly is how this section of Kansas City qualifies. There are other sections of Kansas City that also qualify. But imagine if you are limited in mobility because you don't have a car, you rely on public transportation, and you need to buy fruits and vegetables, it becomes problematic to get to one of these food outlets that exist on the fringes of this community in order to buy groceries. Chances are you're just not going to do it because it's too difficult to acquire that. If you have a car and can drive some distance, then you have the ability to get to a full service grocery store. If you don't have that ability, then you simply don't. When I started looking at this, it was 3 years ago, I guess. And when I looked at this, when I first looked at this, I didn't have the ability yet to map the mapping inequality data onto the maps that I was creating for this. But when I then put the redlined area of town into this, the pattern became apparent to me. Not so much when you look at all types of stores. Oh, now I realize that I'm not sharing my screen. Again, not necessarily when you look at all types of stores, but the difference, for example, in the pattern of the distribution of convenience stores, which are well represented in that section of town, compared to full service supermarkets that are not well represented in that part of town, that it became apparent to me in stark ways that this process of redlining that occurred back in the 1930s has had long-term implications for example, food security in the lives of the people who live in this section of Kansas City. And my guess, and I haven't done this because it's time consuming to do this, every year that I've done this since we first built the data set, I've added something new to it. In this case, this year what I've added to it was I was able to put the geographically referenced plots from the Mapping Inequality website onto the map, and that was time consuming. It took me and my partner, who's behind me, a good portion of a day, and she's way better at doing stuff like this than I am. And so it was time consuming, but once again, once it was done, it's like, oh, that pattern is really obvious to me now that I can see it in reference to other things. Why did development continue out in the direction of Overland Park? So here you see a map where you see the old outline of the city that was red-lined and green-lined and blue-lined, and then you see Overland Park. This is an area that was not red-lined back during that time period, but why did we see development going this direction? And with it, food stores and malls and shopping centers and more housing.
Well, that area was basically the nicest area that was redlined, so it just kind of makes sense that it got further developed.
Yeah, so you see that that's simply an extension of the areas that were coded green and blue back in the 1930s, and you just continued expanding in that direction away from the red and yellow areas. You guys have heard of white flight? Occurred in post-World War II America. What does that term refer to?
Practices of emigration with an E from the cities by white people, as like non-white populations were increasingly becoming dense in the inner cities. White people took to the suburbs.
Yeah, so white flight refers to this movement of white people out of the core urban areas of cities into the suburbs, which basically just segregated the city of Kansas City even more so than it started out. There was segregation between the red and yellow areas and the green and blue areas, and anybody who was still up in this area just moved further away from the red and yellow areas that were also during this time, not just red and yellow from the standpoint of this coding for the disbursement of loans, but were also more black and brown than the areas that were down here. And so you just continue moving this direction. This is also, though, influenced by the interstate. We talked last time about the interstate highway system. This is I-35 running through Overland Park and Olathe, and that certainly facilitated the spread of the city in this direction. Movement northward in Kansas City has always been somewhat hampered by the presence of the river and the fact that you need a bridge in order to get across the river, and that is always going to limit development in the Northland. But once again, because we have I-35 that serves the Northland and I-29 that serves the Northland, and we have a series of bridges, you're seeing more and more development in the Northland. People have migrated about as far south as you can and have a reasonable commute to your job in the city southwards, and so we're now seeing some movement back to the north. So even things like the institution of the interstate highway system finally made mobility such that you could move far away from your place of employment and still get to work in a reasonable amount of time because you now have this big highway to drive on in order to get there. All of these things contributed to the pattern of settlement that we see, and that pattern of settlement that we see has led to a pattern of distribution of food resources. And I would argue, and I think I'm more convinced of it this year than I have been in previous years, that it all traces back to this period of time in Kansas City's history. And of course, that is something that reaches back to, talk to Kenton about this, it reaches back to the very basics of the foundation of our country. One question people say is, why should we be concerned about, these things that happen way back in time? My argument is that the thumbprint of those things that happened way back in time is still very obvious. When you look at your thumbprint, it's a bunch of ridges and valleys. Well, these ridges and valleys are the thumbprint of, in this case, redlining and their influence on food availability. I've had no luck in doing this, but I'm going to attempt to do it again, even though I've had no luck doing it in the past. I had it pulled up a few minutes ago and then I lost it. Let's see if I can get the video. All right, I'm going to see if I can get this to send the sound through your speakers. I don't know if it will work or not. So this is from when Bernie Sanders was back running for president in the previous election, not the most recent election. And let's see if we can get the sounds to you. Can you guys hear that?
I couldn't.
You could not. Okay. All right. Well, I'll just post a link to this. But basically, in this clip, Bernie Sanders is walking around a section of Baltimore. And as he's walking around Baltimore, this is a primarily African-American section of Baltimore, and he's calling attention to the fact that as he walks around this neighborhood, there are no supermarkets, there are no banks, there aren't any of the kind of normal things that white people rely upon to do their normal sort of business of going about life. There are pawn shops and there are convenience stores and stuff like that. But a pawn shop isn't really a bank, and a convenience store isn't really a grocery store. And he makes the point that one of the systemic problems that we have in the United States is a uneven distribution of the resources that people need to kind of get by and have a good life. In Liberty, we have lots of supermarkets, we have lots of banking opportunities, we have everything that we need in order to do the normal everyday functions of getting by in life. There are other parts of Kansas City where you don't have banks and you don't have grocery stores. And those two things are important resources in order for a person to succeed in life and build wealth and do the things that you're kind of expected to do in the United States. But you just can't do that as easily because the resources aren't there. They're not accessible to you. And in this case, we can point to a long history of land development and systematic ways in which loans were given to people or denied people that basically have led to these disparities in the geographic distribution of these kinds of resources. And it befuddles me why people who who could do things about this are not doing things about this, except that there's nothing really in it for them to do anything about it. So anyway, I'll post this clip because it was interesting to me to see a presidential candidate talking about pawn shops, payday loan lenders, and convenience stores, and contrasting that with banks and supermarkets while basically running for president. It was a way in which no other political candidate was talking about poverty in the United States at this particular time. So anyway, further reflections from you guys. How far do you guys live from your nearest grocery store? Put responses in the comments. Chat. What do you estimate your furthest distance is from your nearest full service grocery store? Yeah, we all have really good. Mackenzie, did you live in a rural area?
In Herman, I live out in the middle of nowhere, so the store is like 20 minutes away.
Yeah. So rural people also have this problem. We could also talk about healthcare. We're not talking about healthcare because this is not a class about healthcare, but the same kinds of rules that relate to banking and food also relate to healthcare. People who live in rural areas don't have great access to supermarkets, banks, and healthcare in the same way that people in urban areas don't necessarily have access to those things as well. Any other reflections about this topic? All right. You have one last assignment in addition to the final. I'm trying to remember what day your final is on, because I'm terrible at remembering final dates. So your final is on Wednesday. So I'll post later on today. There will be a reflection paper, instructions for a reflection paper that'll be due when you walk into the final. So the final for this class is Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning. It'll be an online final, so it'll be taken on Socrative. So there won't be any short answer types of questions. It'll just be a multiple choice test. But on that same date at 8 o'clock, I want you to submit to me a reflection paper on food deserts and the distribution of food outlets in the United States. I have a description of what I want that to look like. If I recall correctly, it's only 2 pages. But basically looking at the maps that I presented to you, looking at the information that you were supposed to have read about food, about redlining and things like this. Basically, it's designed to kind of get you to sort through that and think about that. So that's the last 2 things that you have to do in here is the final and that short paper, and we are done. So on Friday, I will talk to you about finals and ask you, or you can ask me any questions you have about that going into that, and that'll be our last day. There are course evaluations that have been sent to you. please fill those out. I realize that you have a slew of those for all of your courses, but don't neglect that aspect of evaluation here at William Jewell. And I will see you guys on Friday.
When will it be posted, do you think?
The instructions,
Yeah.
as soon as I can dig them up off of my computer and get them onto Moodle.
Okay. Do you think you'll email us and let us know that they're posted?
I can do that, sure. Let me make myself
Okay.
a note.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.